Good afternoon, Dr. Litwa. If you don't mind, I would just like to give a brief introduction, so that people are more familiar with your educational background and your academia. So, Dr. David Litwa, he is a scholar of early Christianity. He taught at Virginia Tech, the College of William and Mary, and the University of Virginia. In 2012, he received his PhD from the Religious Studies Department at UVA. He has his Master's of Divinity from Emory University and his THM from Duke University. And he serves as the unit chair of the Bible Myth and Myth Theory at the Society of Biblical Literature. And he's the co chair of the Biblical and Early Christian Studies Seminar at ACU. His specialties include Greco Roman religions, Philonic studies, Gospel and Pauline studies, heresiology, Gnostic and Nag Hammadi studies, ancient philosophy, Greek mystery cults, and much more. So he is extremely knowledgeable and experienced in a wide range of topics concerning early Christianity. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. David Litwa.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Thank you.
The pleasure is all ours. So if you don't mind, we'd like just to kick it off with just a few things that um, are not personal questions, but just to get us to give us like more of a perspective of yourself and what motivated you to pursue this line of scholarship. Um, so the first question, if you don't mind, um, is uh, here we go. What intrigued you or interested you about early Christianity and heresiology, more so than dealing with the established texts for people like textual critics or commentary or anything like that? What motivated you in your early life or just your interests to pursue this line of scholarship?
Well, I guess what motivates me is just this is simply the task of history, right? You don't have the right to ignore people who, in terms of the later developments and the later evolution of religious thought, were later classified as sort of outside the tradition or at the boundaries or at the margins of the tradition. Because if you're thinking historically, what was the center and the periphery has moved and shifted throughout time. So that when we in our century look back, and it could be, the 7th century, it could be the 1st century, what looks to us like periphery was at the time quite central. So the historian has to be motivated to give everyone a fair shake. So I know that, from the modern perspective, you might think, well, okay, so the four canonical gospels, those were the the ones known by everybody. Or Clement of Alexandria was known so much more than Marcion, or Simon of Samaria, or these other central Christian figures who were active in Syria and Palestine, and one of my favorites, which is maybe relevant for this program, is Monoemus, who's specifically called the Arab in the sources. Um, and yeah, he's virtually unknown, but in terms of what he was in his own time and where he was in his geographical location, he may have been absolutely well known. And you know, it's all hindsight, right? And when we pick, who's important, we normally think of those who are upholding some kind of I don't know, orthodox or centrist tradition, but that just isn't the case for history. People are all over the map, and it's the duty of a historian, always and everywhere, to be motivated to look at everybody and to give everyone a fair shake, as it were.
That is highly commendable and honorable that you are trying to yeah trying to kind of um, give a little bit of emphasis on these people who have been relegated to quote unquote like Gnosticism or heretics and just dismissed. And that actually that's what I find most interesting about this as well, as we'll see in I guess hopefully later on in the interview. And so my second question is, I didn't know where to place this question, whether in the beginning or the end. So you can say that I'm like the Gospel of Mark according to Papias. It's like all out of order. But what in your studies that you encountered or concluded was the biggest shock? Was the biggest, like, something that surprised you most, or kind of served as a contrast to what you initially thought going in, and what you found out, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the more I study the material that I do, the more I'm convinced that there was incredible and important diversity going on in Christianity, and because of the Holocaust, there has been in Western scholarship a strong emphasis in the past 70 years on Judaism and the Jewish matrix for Christianity, and that's all well and good. I mean, it's I think it's part of our culture, and I certainly belong to that culture. Became an expert in Judaism as well as Christianity. I mean, you can't do one without the other. But the more and more that I studied this material, I began to see how important it is to see that Jews are and were, I should say, part of that Greco Roman world and that Mediterranean mentality. Most of the Jews, similar to the situation today, where you have a vast amount of Jewish people living in America and in other locations, the diaspora Judaism of Jesus' day was larger than the Judaism that was in the homeland, what they considered their homeland. So this is important because even for Jews in the area of Palestine, they were very well integrated and what we might call acculturated into those Mediterranean values. Just as today you might think of, a place like, you know, Puerto Rico as, influenced by American values. That's very much the case for Palestine in the Greco-Roman world in terms of the Hellenic culture. And so, really, these arguments that have been between scholars as to what what is Christianity's main influence. Um, to say that it's Judaism doesn't mean that you exclude anything of the Greco-Roman world, because those Jews were as much a part of the Greco-Roman world as anybody else in the Greco-Roman world was. That is, if you were Phrygian, you were part of the Greco-Roman world. If you were Egyptian, you were part of the Greco-Roman world. Syrian, you were part of the Greco-Roman world. And, as far as Iran, people were boasting of being what they called Phil-Hellenic, that is, lovers of that Greek culture, and they put it on their coins. They advertised themselves as happy to receive that influence. Not simply to receive it passively, but they adapted and adopted what they wanted to, and took the benefits of things like Greco-Roman baths, Greco-Roman artwork, uh, Greco-Roman statuary, in some cases iconography, other kinds of plays and theater and reading. I mean, in terms of book production. So these were simply technological and cultural things that everybody absorbed, just as today everybody absorbs the latest technology. So I guess this is what I've been more and more convinced of, that we can never succumb to saying that um, you know that Judaism is somehow utterly distinct, and therefore Christianity is somehow utterly distinct from its culture. No, they're living religions are living, breathing entities, and even if they try to hole up, for instance, in Qumran, we still, when we look at their documents, we see how very much influenced they were by Hellenic cosmology, and so I guess that's how I would answer that. There's more to say there, but I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. So I guess, and this is something that a lot of us feel about all theologies and all uh, different ideologies and pieces of history, where we feel like it's just monolithic. It's like a scintillating ornament of history that is completely divorced from any influence. And you're saying that it's more uh, more kind of entrenched, not entrenched, but like the the cultures and the influences are interwoven within it, and they develop, I guess, simultaneously.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's just it's human nature, you know. I mean, even if you're buried somewhere, and you've got this cultural enclave, and you've developed this very strong subculture, you know, when you walk outside and you breathe the air, or are, as you are today, bombarded with advertisements and with, you know, clothing styles and cultural codes are coming at you 1,000 miles an hour. So if you're, you know, assuming that, you know, you're part of the world, you're using the technologies, you know, you're doing what people normally do in cultures and human cultures. You are, or the human brain is an absorbing machine. It's not a passive absorbing machine. It's some, when you absorb information, you also adapt it to your own cultural particularities, your own preferences. And, you know, we all have a self-confirming bias too, so we tend to look at the things which tend to confirm us in our own identity, and identity is very important, but none of us are an island.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, in that case, you would take kind of a less I guess a less uh, sure view of how, for example, things like Greco-Roman elements were used when composing the biblical text. So people like Dennis MacDonald will say, no, they actually did intend to mimic what he calls mimicism, to mimic these stories. And would it be fair to say that you're saying that it was just in the background, in the minds of these writers, and so they utilized, you know, what they've learned and what they've been conditioned to write as?
Exactly, yeah. So my theory, I call it a dynamic cultural interaction, and it's just to say that, you know, most of us are socialized to believe in certain things, and we, if there's a certain like canon of literature that we hear every day, or maybe there's a really really popular movie that, you know, we're like, I don't know, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or something like that, and, you know, where everyone is kind of culturally influenced by something. You know, you pick up bits and pieces here, even if you don't read the books, or you don't go to the movies, you hear so many references and you see it in so many places. That's similar to how a, you know, a Greco-Roman, you know, a Jew or an Egyptian, or even an Arab would, in the Greco-Roman world, be walking around town and they'd see hundreds of statues and they'd hear plays and they would see artwork, and all of it would be on the themes of what we today call Greco-Roman mythology, but which for the Hellenes themselves was just their mainstream culture, right? So, Batman, Superman, the Hulk, but Heracles, and Romulus and Asclepius, and so, and you see these figures everywhere, and, you know, there's even, in the case of Homer, there's even, you know, public recitations of poetry, of Homer's poetry, called Rhapsody, which, you know, you will hear, so that even if you can't read, you do absorb the material. I do think that, yeah, my disagreement with Dennis is simply that it's too, uh, almost too simplistic, genetic, and mechanical to think that, you know, gospel writers had sort of Homer open on their desk, and then they were kind of like thinking to themselves, how can I reshape this story? I'm not sure everything was such a conscious process, or that it was so, you know, sort of like line by line looking at Homer and then trying to create an invented life of somebody else. Um, I think that they had absorbed lots and lots of Homer, and lots, not just Homer, but of Euripides and of Plato and of Herodotus and all these other, you know, so lights of the Hellenic world, so to speak. Just as today, you know, people have absorbed a little bit of Shakespeare. I mean, you may not have ever read a play of Shakespeare, but you know Shakespeare's lines, like "to err is human," or you know, "to be or not to be." I mean, you might not even
Yes,
know
yes.
that's from Shakespeare, but but you have absorbed that through your cultural knowledge, and that's how it was for most people reading Homer. Whether you were, you know, one of the leading intellectual lights, or, you know, the washerwoman, you know, cleaning the sheets.
Oh man, this is such such a salient and like deep point. There are so many questions that we could branch off. I know our time is limited, so this is like my last question for my segment, and then I'll hand it over to Brother Khalid. But when I was reading something that you recommended, the First New Testament by Jason B. Dunn, in
Mhm.
his introduction, he writes, the first generations of Christians formed diverse local groups with several distinct understandings of their experience of Jesus Christ and divergent interpretations of the meaning of his instruction. The letters of Paul provide only momentary snapshots in an ongoing struggle over the legacy of Christ, and we have no reliable knowledge of the ultimate outcome of these conflicts and the lives of their participants. Instead, we peer into a dark space of early Christian history, between the more or less datable letters of Paul and the writings of late second century Christians such as Irenaeus of Lyons and Clement of Alexandria. The century and a half between is full of floating, disembodied voices that we can fix in time and place only tentatively, sound bites from a tumultuous period of division, debate, and self definition. So, in light of that, I wanted to ask, given what we know about the early period, whatever is extant, whatever we can reliably reconstruct, and our sources for that, how much can we know about the early first century history?
Not very much. But this, it's an interesting question because it's really a question about everything. When you ask a question like, what was going on in Mesopotamia 10,000 years ago? Um, well, when all you've got is soil samples and a half broken cuneiform tablet, you're not going to know very much. And a lot of it is going to be based on inference. It doesn't matter which century that you're in, right? Even if, I mean, our sort of culture is it's in a way spoiled because we have things like video cameras and phones and pictures and tape recordings and diaries and all this other stuff where we think we can piece together. But even in our world, right? What version are you going to piece together? Is it the CNN version or the Fox News version? I mean, the overload of information um, is going to cause friction and dissonance as well. Uh, so when you're dealing with any kind of ancient source from any century, and you want to look back and you want to ask the question, well, what what happened? Um, the first principle of history is a principle of humility, and that humility is we don't really know, and even if 90% of the sources survived, we still wouldn't really know because what we're asking about is a sort of replay of human experience, and we can never replay human experience. That's impossible. The only thing that we can do is reconstruct human experience and then narrativize it. Okay, and then that narrative isn't the same thing as uh, you know somebody's actual experience of it. I mean, the only way we would actually experience the past is if we had a time machine, but nobody has that, at least to my knowledge. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we're all sort of this is a science fiction thing, and maybe some people do have time bending technology. Who knows? But as far as I know, no one can go back to the past and actually re-experience reality as it was hitting the people of the past. So everything is a reconstruction. And especially, this is especially important because when humans form identities, they try to form traditions based on what they think of as sure and concrete historical knowledge. People want to prove the resurrection because it actually happened. And if they had cameras back then, they could have taken a picture of Jesus as he was crawling out of the tomb, or however it happened. But that's probably also too arrogant for a historian to say. A historian has to, like Socrates, say, we have to come and say that we know we have to confess that we know that we don't know. And it's those people who claim to say, no, we know, um, when they can't possibly know, who are involving themselves in a series of self-deceptions, because there is no way you could know certain events of the past, because we can't experience the past. The past is long and dead. And when we're gone 2,000 years from now, and all that's left is a fragment of CNN and Fox News, some poor historian 2,000 years from now is going to try to piece together what the news was on, September, I don't know what is today, the 24th, or, you know, it's going to be very hard for them and impossible for them to uh, redescribe our experience as it actually happened, because that's just not how history works. History looks at all the evidence, looks at all the sources, and tries to create a plausible narrative about what happened. But none of us say that we can, tell you, you know, this happened. That's not history. That's just dogmatism. And often that dogmatism is used uh, as a kind of crutch to shore up a doctrine, which is important for the identity of a certain group of people, right? I mean, none of us have experienced Jesus's resurrection, and we never will, for instance. So we can't say that it's like a newspaper report, that here's the evidence, or like a lawyer's brief, and here's the evidence, XYZ from the Gospels, QED, we got it, proved. That's just not how history works. That's a mistake. That's somebody just saying, resurrection is important for my identity, so I'm going to look for evidence to say that it happened, or that at least plausibly happened. That's totally fine, but that's not history. That's shoring up an identity based on your particular religious tradition, and we just need to distinguish those two things.
Thank you so much. Yes, I absolutely agree. I think on another interview, somebody asked you a similar question about how much can we know about the life of Jesus, or these other figures or whatever. And you said that it's relatively an easy question for an honest historian, that it's absolutely nothing, and that we shouldn't have our chests, puffed up like roosters, saying, "Oh, we know this absolutely happened," when our sources are very scant, they're fragmentary, and they come from much later with a lot of embellishments. Would you say that that's uh, a good summary of why you think that that reconstructing the past absolutely, especially with regards to early Christianity, is problematic? One, because of the nature of our sources and our inability to kind of uh, transcend them.
Yeah, but in that sense, Christianity isn't unique. I mean, you could do that for anything. I mean, it also, we're sort of addicted to what we think is important. But I mean, I can't even reconstruct the experience of myself tying my shoe this morning. I mean, because it's gone. It's just in the past. And you know, this is I think, yes, you're basically right. This is my position, and it's what I consider to be a healthy agnosticism. You can never, but just to be clear, I'm saying that you can never be sure or certain that event A happened in the past as it's described in text B, um, but you can always make a plausible reconstruction, and the history deals with things that aren't certain. We deal with probabilities, and so it's always a probability calculus, but those probabilities are also determined by subjective biases, and none of us are computers. We're all, in a sense, trying to shore up bits and pieces of our identity, and we get interested in things because they are important for us personally. So there's no hiding that. There's no absolute dispassion. So the point is that, yeah, we'll never be sure, but we can sure as heck try our best to reconstruct something plausible. And that something is plausible when you've done the real hard academic work. You've looked at the evidence. You've looked at everything. You haven't been You have tried to master your biases. You've bracketed your presuppositions. You have looked at the material with new eyes. You've listened to your opponents and you've been critiqued by your opponents. You've gone through the peer review system, and then you produce a book or an article or whatever it is. A highly educated blog article. Whatever it is, you've worked hard at it to be as plausible as possible, and that's the best we can do.
Agreed, totally agreed. And I think this is also like the schism that exists also within uh, biblical textual scholarship, whether some scholars say you can reconstruct the originals based on what we know, and many others saying you can't reconstruct the originals. It's just a matter of what you think is, I guess, most plausible, or whether that is even an endeavor worth pursuing. But Khalid, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You want to take it over for the next question?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah, good afternoon from your side, Dr. Litwa, and good evening from my side. My apologies for not greeting you before. I had to handle a few tasks. How are you?
Good, thanks.
All right. I hope we can interact for the next few minutes, and we'll spice up the questions a little bit, and we'll see where it goes from here, and maybe test uh, the information that we know from the early century of Christianity. So I'd like to tie it more into one of your books called Found Christianities. So, based on what we know, right, would you say that you would give different epistemic weights to different historical figures, because we know that there is one side, such as quote unquote orthodoxy, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, Polycarp, Papias, and so on, that make certain historical claims against uh, what they call heretics, or these heresiologists. Would you put more epistemic claim towards them, or the so-called heretics, such as Marcion, Valentinus, Basilians, and so on and so forth? And how would you evaluate that?
Well, history has to work according to a basic democratic principle, which is to say that no one's voice is louder because of their reception in later history. Okay, so we all standing where we are on the arrow of time look back and say, "Oh, okay, Irenaeus, he was the dude. He was my guy. I mean, he established the tradition, and I love this stuff, and so I'm gonna let him be the loudest voice in the second century." That's wrong. But it's equally wrong to say, oh, my buddy Marcion, yeah, they tried to destroy him, but his voice still cries out in the wilderness. And, his theology is really, really in depth, and he really had it right about, Greco-Roman deities and the Hebraic deity. And I really appreciate his text criticism, and I think he's the best thing since sliced bread. And so I'm going to let his voice totally dominate. No, you can't do either of that. You've got to treat people equally. I mean, ultimately, we don't know who's speaking the loudest. I mean, what's loudest to us now, it wasn't what was loudest to them or was most significant or what have you. People always, just as they do today, belong to certain communities and regional communities. And so, if you're in Rome in the year 150, Marcion and his church, as he called it, you might have he might have been the loudest voice in your vicinity, and therefore he was the most significant and important to you. Whereas if you're in the year 185 in Lyon and Irenaeus is your bishop, well, he might have been the loudest voice for you. But what's the point of history? The point for history is to give everybody a fair shake and to see who's moving whom, who's influencing whom. um, and you can't really pick and choose. Like it would be wrong for me, and I try to make this point in Found Christianities. It would be wrong to me just to focus on so-called marginal figures. Likewise, it would be wrong simply to focus on the so-called early Catholic thinkers. because both are going to give you a distorted picture. Ultimately, what we need is a history that brings everybody together and doesn't play this game of saying, well, Marcion, he was kind of important, but then again, he was not Orthodox, so we don't have to pay too much attention to him. That's the dominant voice, okay, even today in Christian history. And it's not surprising because those who are funded to do that kind of history are, they're the church today, the Catholic Church and other kinds of churches, they're multi-billion-dollar organizations who fund churches, seminaries, and schools. And they're all heroes picked out. It's Augustine, it's Luther, it's, Irenaeus is well up there. So they're going to fund research on those kinds of figures. But if you're just doing history, outside of a particular tradition, in, let's just say, at the academy, you don't have a right to pick and choose, and you've got to give everybody equal epistemic weight to start off, to draw the context and make your conclusions.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And we ought to go ahead where the evidence points towards and go for the best probable explanation, right? And we make inferences from there. So we shouldn't favor, oh, Marcion, fits my doctrines better, therefore he ought to be better, or I'm a Christian, therefore I need to uphold orthodoxy, so Irenaeus' testimony has more weight. Correct?
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. So then that would lead me to the next question, which is somewhat related, that has to do with the idea of epistemic weight and testimony. So just to confirm, uh, you've stated on multiple other interviews that you do date the Gospels to the 2nd century. Is that correct?
Not exactly. So the most important thing for your listeners to understand is that we have no originals, and there's a huge black hole and a gap. So we have no gospel texts on papyrus until the late 2nd century. Okay, now this is something that's relatively new, because there have been claims by Christians, that we had bits and pieces from early 2nd century texts, but those have been very slowly, and we owe Brenton Onbury a debt of gratitude for this, for showing that those early datings, or those early 2nd century datings, are based on misreading of the handwriting, because the handwriting, you can only judge, if you have a credit card size version of a text that's just, a fragment. The only way you can date it is you have to look at the handwriting, and that's a very subjective process. So yeah, basically, we have nothing material. We have no material evidence for the text of the New Testament until the late 2nd century. So that's the first point. So then when was it written? Well, all that's a reconstruction, right? And usually the more conservative you are, the more early you want to get it, because you don't want memory to degrade, right? We all know that human memory degrades pretty fast. My wife says that for me, it degrades within the space of an hour. And she's partially right about that. But the truth is, if I knew a dude 20 years ago and he was a big influence on my life, and then I wanted to write that dude's biography, or that lady's biography, I would have to, yeah, I'd be then writing something that I had spent 20 years of, mental revision, going through in my mind, and, slightly changing and altering the memories. And for the past 20 years, I might have been talking to other people who knew that person, and they might have shifted my opinion on things, and I might have learned more stories. And all of it is just sort of jumbled in my brain. And then when I put pen to paper, finally, I'm not going to write something like, a newspaper report. I'm gonna write my reflections that are based on years and years and years of thinking in community with other people, and that's what the Gospels are. So by the time, there's two kinds of memory. There's that immediate memory, and then there's more what's called cultural memory. By the whether when the Gospels are written, which is usually most critical scholars are going to say the earliest narrative gospel of Mark is around 70, so that it's 40 years after Jesus' death. By that time, the immediate memory of the generation who knew him had definitely degraded. So there comes a point where it doesn't matter if you're 40 years out or you're 60 years out or you're 80 years out. If you're beyond the 40 or 45-year landmark, your immediate memory has degraded and has turned into basically cultural memory. Okay. And that cultural memory is sort of like the memory that we have of Abraham Lincoln. Nobody knows what nobody knew Abraham Lincoln personally. Okay. Now, so that would be different than from, Martin Luther King Jr. Maybe today, not many anymore, but maybe today, some people knew Dr. Martin Luther King personally, and therefore they could give us personal memories. In 10 years, that's no longer going to be a possibility, okay, probably. For Abe Lincoln, definitely not a plausibility. No, definitely not a possibility, okay? Dead and gone. All that we have are written artifacts about him. No one knew him personally, okay? So when the gospel writers begin writing 40 years after Jesus' death, not a single one of them says that they knew him personally. Not a single one. And you've got to be thinking that, this is a culture where autopsy is very important. And if a historian wants to sound good and to sound accurate, then they say things like, well, I experienced this myself, and that's why I'm writing this report. Well, the gospel writers never say that. They never identify themselves as as apostles, as anybody who's anybody. Okay, so they're all late, and it doesn't really matter if you're late first century or early second century, because you're still dealing with that same kind of cultural memory, right? No one is a personal eyewitness. No one, absolutely no one. And if they were, they would have said so, because their culture was all about that. If they could have that accolade, if they could put that gold star on their chest and say, yes, I knew Jesus personally, high five, they would have. None of them did, because no, there was no immediate memory left. So yes, I do date most of the Gospels in the late second century, or sorry, in the late first century still, but one also has to take account of the fact that they are moving targets. Okay, so we don't know what's happening in the manuscripts between, say, 70 and 175. When first textual evidence emerges. So there's more than 100-year gap where we don't know what's changing and not changing in the manuscripts. So in effect, it doesn't really matter if you say that it's late first century or early second, because it all amounts to the same thing. It's all cultural memory, all of it.
So if I can interject just real quick, I really love the comment on this idea of orality and to some degree literacy. You mentioned a lot about it, and it reminded me of the writings like Albert Lord and Walter Ong and or John Bencina, and it reminded me of a lot of their literature and writings. And so that leads me to the second portion of this question, which is, if the evidence is like very much up and down, and it's somewhat all over the place, and I use that word loosely, and no one can really be sure, why do you think, or what would be your proposition or your opinion on why is it that, at least because I live in the U.S., at least within Western scholarship, meaning the UK and the Americas, why do they still push this idea, like Bruce Metzger, Carol Alland, Philip Comfort, all these people? They keep sticking to the traditional narrative, which is Mark 70, Matthew 80, Luke 80, 85, and John is 90, 95. If all the evidence is that like sparse and widespread.
Yeah, I mean, they cannot possibly know, right? I mean, it really, it doesn't matter if some of us look at these old professors in the 20th century, and it really goes back. All the datings really go back to German professors of the 19th century. I mean, in Germany was really that first burst of light, as it were, for historical critical scholarship, and they knew it, and they're still proud of it. Um, all these dates are traditional, right? They have become traditional since the late 19th century. So, um, you know, is there any way any of us, no matter what our reputation is, if we're teaching at Harvard or Yale, is there any way that any of us can really pin down these documents in terms of a date or a date range that's only a decade long? Well, no, we can't. And I think any historian worth his or her salt would tell you, yes, we can't do that. These are estimations. They are often repeated estimations. And what happens, unfortunately, when you repeat something so often, it becomes ossified in your mind, so that a young seminarian goes to school and, you know, wants to learn as much as he can about the Bible and doesn't want to deal with all the ambiguity and the ambivalence. And if we can date a document within a single decade, well, then it becomes, sure knowledge, and we can test you on it and, grade you. But that's really not how history ever worked. I mean, think of Homer, again, or of any of the documents in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, could we ever date any of these within a single decade? No, and they're not that different from the so-called New Testament documents. They are older, but they're not that different because, again, we don't have a manuscript tradition. Like if we had a manuscript tradition and we could carbon date something back to, the year 75, well, then we could do that. But that is not forthcoming. And we have looked far and wide. We have nothing, absolutely nothing, textually that survives from the first century. So yes, if your teacher told you that Matthew was written in the year 80, and didn't explain to you that that is just a very, very rough estimation based on something else, which is a very, very rough estimation, well, that teacher did you a disservice. And you should always think of these as estimations and guesstimations and be open to redating.
Yeah, when I began my journey into reading Christianity, that caught my attention, which is I've always been sticking with the traditional idea, which is 70, 80 to 85, and then 90 for the Johannine literature. And then I came across a lot of the Marcionite writings, such as Marcus Vincent and Matthias Klinghart, and even some of your works, and Jason Bidon. And then they showed how it's not as clear cut and crisp as people would like it to be. There are some people who push towards a second century dating, like Marcus Vincent puts at 138 to 144. So yeah, that was a very interesting answer, and thank you very much. So I have only two questions left, and then I'll pass it back to Wissam. So then, I know you're very well read, and a lot of your work on found Christianities does talk about these early, what we modern day so-called heretics, right? That the heresiologists called. And so I was just wondering, we know that Marcion had Chip, and he had a lot of like Pauline influence on him, and he had his own gospel. Of course, these things are not for absolute certainty, but at least from what we can extract from people like Origen or against Trypho or to Marcion by Just a Martyr and Tertullian, and Irenaeus. How much influence would you say Marcion had on the Christian civilization back then, and what population would you estimate was like Marcionite? Would it be a great degree, or would it be like small minority and whatnot?
Yeah, well, it would depend on where you were, of course. You know, there are very few Protestants, in Greece. Um, almost everyone is Greek Orthodox. That's just the kind of Christianity that has kind of taken hold. Um, yeah, so what's interesting about Marcion is, yeah, so he comes from Asia Minor, and we think that he's active in Asia Minor for a good while until he gets to Rome. And from Rome, yeah, he gets this idea that he can build his own ecclesial community, basically, build his own church, and he's got lots of he's got the money to back him. And he basically starts what can be called a world mission. And we can tell the sort of nuclear impact of Marcion from the attacks that came against him. So we know that between the period of 150 and 200, there were at least 15, I think possibly 16 full treatises, full on, writings against Marcion. And so somebody was feeling very, very threatened. A host of intellectuals were feeling very, very threatened. And when there's that much of an impact, you know that someone is very influential. We know that Marcion had a very influential disciple called Apelles, and his church, survived for many, many centuries. Okay, and in certain areas, he seems to have dominated in the areas of Syria and Edessa, where there's a strong ascetic impulse. Marcion wanted baptized believers to remain absolutely celibate. So that's a big commitment, and that didn't take off everywhere. But it did. It was very popular in Syria and in Palestine. A few famous stories there. Even Walter Bauer knew that in Edessa, the Marcionites were called Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century and up until the 4th century, so that when you asked for the Christian church, they'd bring you to the Marcionites, and that so-called early Catholics were called Pelagians, and they were the minority. We've got a story from Cyril of Jerusalem saying that, he's in the late 4th century, and he says that, when you have a visitor come into Jerusalem and they ask, where's the Christian church, make sure that you lead them to the Catholic Church, because chances are, if you say a Christian church, they're going to lead you to the Marcionite building. And so you see a lot of people who are worried about the spread of Marcion, and we know that he basically creates a global church movement. So he's in North Africa, he's in Egypt, he's in Rome, he's in Spain, he's in Gaul, and he is in Syria and Palestine. So was he ever the majority anywhere? Probably your best bet is Syria and what's now Eastern Turkey. But yeah, we can never do demographics, unfortunately, when we come to early Christians.
And I'd like to just say one thing, like with regards to what you said about asceticism, and I always found that to be kind of like a mark of sincerity. If somebody who has such fame and popularity would command his followers and himself to abstain from things like alcohol or sex in general, whereas later heresiologists, they are claiming that certain factions were like swimming in each other's seminal fluid or whatever, or eating each other's like menstrual blood or whatever. But is it true that is it true that Marcion really used water instead of wine for the Eucharist?
Absolutely, yeah. So the book to read here is Andrew McGowan's book called Ascetic Eucharists, and absolutely. But it wasn't only Marcion. So here's a place where it doesn't make sense to talk about orthodoxy and heresy, because Tertullian too demands an all-water Eucharist. So here's a place where Tertullian and Marcion are in absolute agreement. And there's other Christian groups whom I study, the Sethians in the Refutation of All Heresies. They don't have alcohol. And you've got a couple groups in Epiphanius's Panarion, who absolutely forbid wine, and they even claim that the devil was the one who planted the vine.
Hmm. Okay, yeah. Sorry, Khalid, go ahead.
So I got one last question. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Litwa. So I think then this would tie into the last two key words you use, which is heresiology and orthodoxy. And it really like caught my attention on how you, if I would say it correctly and word it, which is you try to abstain from using these words because if you do, you end up giving some form of credence to some degree. And so the question would be basically, uh, given that basically the majority of what we know about church history or early Christianity from the first, second, third century comes from these, like what we call now heresiologists, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Justin Martyr, or Origen, Eusebius, and so on and so forth. Knowing their like persona, their historical, them as a historical figure, and their ethical tendencies, how much credence would you give to their testimonies or their certain reports?
Well, just very quickly, I mean, that was true. What you're saying was true before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library and Proust Codex and Codex Chekos. Where we are now, you can have an entire scholarly career in which you completely throw out the heresiologists and just do your historical work from, well, the works in Nag Hammadi. So yeah, we're no longer the playthings of the heresiologists. So that's the first point. But absolutely, you can't do good history without knowing how to read heresiology. So you've got to be a good reader, and you treat them like you treat anybody else. I mean, you don't accept everybody's testimony just by implicit faith. That's never how historical scholarship works. You're always comparing, and you're seeing if there's contradictions in what they themselves are saying. The heresiologists contradict themselves all the time, and they contradict each other. So that even if we didn't have Nag Hammadi and all these checks in terms of the primary sources, then we would still be able to check up on the heresiologists because they don't agree, and you've got to sift them just as you would sift the Gospels, which also don't agree. So when you're determining what is historically plausible and what is not historically plausible, you always have to have a system of checks and balances. And if you can confirm something through archaeology or through a manuscript discovery or some kind of new information, or confirming testimony, then something becomes plausible. But no, you never take anybody, heresiologists or not, exactly at their word.
Thank you, Dr. Litwa. That would be like my last question for now. I'll pass it on to Wesam.
Thank you, Khaled. I appreciate it. I know we're nearing the time that was allotted for this interview, but I mean, thank you so much again for gracing us with your attendance here and with your knowledge. And while I still have the floor, please, everyone who's in the audience, who's not followed by any of the speakers, everyone, please, can you uh, definitely sign up to his Patreon. Whichever tier that you sign up for, you're going to have like access to knowledge and material that it's pretty much you can't get anywhere else. People who know me and the things that I speak about and the things that I'm interested in, I get a lot of that stuff from reading Professor Litwa's work and uh, going into the rabbit holes of all of these different topics. So yeah, definitely consider signing up to his Patreon. It's worth every penny and more. But Dr. Litwa, this is also something in regards to the difference between what we find archaeologically and sometimes the things that are said by the patristic sources. So I remember in a book, Beyond Belief by Elaine Pagels, where she discusses the Gospel of Thomas. And she said before the discovery, just based on what she's read on the gospel itself, because it was never available to us in any type of reconstruction before the discovery, if I'm not mistaken. But she said she was like kind of bracing herself to see all of these like disgusting, horrific things that are found within, the gospel. And then when she read it, to her chagrin, it was pretty much like orthodox. And I remember anecdotally discussing this with a Christian friend of mine. He's like, "Oh, Gospel of Thomas? No, that's Gnostic. It talks about a different God, that the God is, a different God of the world is a different God than the creator God, and all these beliefs." And I asked him, "Have you ever read the Gospel of Thomas?" And he said, "No, but it's Gnostic. This is what it means." And then when I shared it with him, he really didn't have much to disagree with outside of the last teaching about women. So, can you comment briefly on what Nag Hammadi, and because you mentioned it in passing, like the importance of that library.
Definitely, yeah. Well, let me first say that in Found Christianities, you know, I deliberately I don't use the term Gnosticism or even Gnostic, and that book proves that you can write a history uh, of all these figures who have been Gnosticized and hereticalized without ever using the term Gnostic or heretic. And so that's what we're all striving for. Those are simply religious insider ideological terms, and they are based on excluding people so that you can shore up what you think is your own identity. So they have nothing to do with history, and they never will. So why Nag Hammadi is so important is because it allows us, yeah, to step out of the out of the radio wavelength of the heresiologist and hear a different voice. Now, again, in that case, we're all, it's maybe Elaine Pagels, when she was first reading the Gospel of Thomas, got a little bit too excited, right? That, this was the true gospel or the earliest gospel or, the true voice of Jesus. It's not any more true than any other gospel. It's not any more earlier than any other gospel. But it is, and why it's significant is because it's a different voice. It's a different voice than what we've heard. It's a voice that was buried, deliberately so, by people who didn't want it, but we know that it was very well read in the 2nd and 3rd century because we actually have manuscript discoveries of little papyrus fragments of Thomas, and we've had them since the very late 1890s. So everybody's known that they were reading this way, way down in Egypt. And if they were reading this way, way down in Egypt, they were reading it everywhere. Because, if you find a text, in some local, farm town, you're going to find it in all the major cities. So that's the situation with Thomas. It's very well read at its time, and it's a different voice. It's not any more authentic. We're not talking about authenticity here. That's just more religious kind of style rhetoric. What we're talking about is just a different voice. And that different voice gives us a different picture of Jesus. And it is fundamentally different than anything that the heresiologists say. And that's really important. I've got an article called Stratiotics and Amphibianites in which I talk about the group that, supposedly drank menstrual blood and ate, their own semen. And, I kind of go through what they actually were and what was going on and so on and so forth. And that's important to do. But one of the reasons that Nag Hammadi is so important is because it serves as a check against everything that the heresiologists have said. And yes, when you read the Nag Hammadi library, it's overwhelmingly ascetic. These people were more morally strict than any early Catholic ever. And that is what made, people like Clement of Alexandria and Epiphanius, shiver in their boots, because for them, moral authority gave them, a voice. And so, yeah, if you can criticize your enemy as immoral somehow, you can undermine their authority. And that's exactly what they did. But they were completely, in their own time, it seems, threatened by their opponents who were more celibate, more abstemious, more ascetic than they were.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, there was one time where I witnessed you. You were just kind of like rattling off a Greek translation of some text. I forgot what it was, and it was just like so fluent, and mashallah, it really inspired me. I'm like, I want to get to that level where I can just read these texts and for myself and benefit from them. And it brings a question to my mind about like philology and the way where you said, and you clarified this many times, whereas dating is very obscure, it's very probabilistic. But sometimes we find people try to date documents, like the Gospel of Thomas yourself. You just clarified that you can't really know whether it's earlier or whether it's later than these traditions, because the manuscripts start here, and then you have to kind of like apply these probabilistic criteria to say, okay, what does it resemble, what does it not resemble, the language. But there are people who say, for outlandish things like, hey, based on 1 Corinthians 15, we know that this creed emerged 3 or 6 months after Jesus' death. What do you make of people who use like philology for dating manuscripts or for dating creeds or ideologies?
Well, that's not what philology is for, and that's not what it does. Yeah. I mean, there's a general rule that whenever you find someone who's like really, really certain and dogmatic about a certain point, you always want to question that and question the motivations and the overall medicine for that kind of uh, I don't know what to call it, but semi scholarship or ideological scholarship is to say, what can the sources actually tell us? Okay, so if you want to say that something is a pre-Pauline hymn because it's a Pauline letter, well, you might be able to say that, but then if you go on and say that, it was sung in the year 43 at Philippi at 7 a.m. Well, obviously, that's not what history is. That's not the kind of detailed construction or reconstruction anybody can give you. Um, so, yeah, when you, it's just a matter of going back to the sources and being familiar with the sources and not being a prisoner of English translations or whatever you're reading. Yeah, as I think I've said many times, I mean, if you can go back and you can read the original Greek, it's liberating because you see that translations they always traduce. That is, they never. There's always a bit of trickery in translations. They can never render something, one to one. They're all estimations. And some translations are unfortunately ideological. I mean, think about who produces and translates Bibles. Well, churches churches do that. Churches have their, evangelicals have their, are so well funded, and they have their own publishing houses, in the States and elsewhere, Zondervan and Baker and all of them, and IVP. They're all evangelically funded, and so, yes, they produce a Bible translation that they like with their own evangelical scholars, and bada bing, bada boom, you get a translation which is basically ideologically combed over, and it's impossible to escape that. I mean, you could get five different translations, but think of the time that you waste by doing that. By if you apply yourself for 1 or 2 years to even basic New Testament Greek, you'll be able to just to throw all of those away for good, and revel in a much more immediate style of knowledge. So I commend you in your Greek studies.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, right now, so I'm just going through like William Mounce and Duolingo, so quite the quite the different levels of resources. But thank you so much. Hopefully, we can one day get to your level, because hearing that you know like Syriac and Coptic and all of these different languages is just awesome. I get to learn it before my brain stops retaining stuff. But my last question is, again, it's completely out of order. This is my first time conducting an interview such as this. I'm very intrigued by this character Cerinthus. And when I read like the patristic literature, I read that that this is even something acknowledged by the early sources, that John, the gospel, the apostle John, composed his gospel as a result of hearing about his heresies in some sort of bathhouse with Polycarp. But then when we were reading Marcus Vincent's book, it seems like you have the outside sources like the anti-Marcionite prologues, which seem to suggest that it was as a result of Marcion's antithesis that John decided to compile his true gospel or something like that. Do I have that correct, or what can you tell us about the person Cerinthus and his relation to the Gospel of John?
Well, so yeah, it's impossible to know for certain, but what we do know about Cerinthus is that he's very, very early. We can date him to the late first century, and we can locate him to the region of Asia Minor, which is Western Turkey, and uh, that's about all we know for sure. We have very consistent testimony that he had a theory about how Jesus became divine at his baptism by being sort of possessed by a divine spirit, which came into him in the form of a bird or a dove. And that's how Jesus became a divine agent. And we've got another story that says, Cerinthus shared a bathhouse in Ephesus with John. We don't know which John. It doesn't really matter. They're all mixed up anyway. And that John refused to take a bath with Cerinthus inside the bathhouse because he was afraid that God would knock down the building. And so he runs out basically naked. And it's a fun story, and it gets retold. And sometimes Marcion takes the place of Cerinthus. So you see how these stories aren't really accurate anyway. But I think probably the most important evidence, if you're looking for Cerinthus's potential authorship of John, is to really take a good look at a figure named Gaius. And Gaius is a Roman presbyter in the late 2nd century, and he rejects the book of Hebrews quite deliberately, and he also rejects the Apocalypse of John and the 4th Gospel. And apparently that's because he thought that Cerinthus wrote the 4th Gospel, that is the so-called Gospel according to John. But the trick with Gaius is, we know that Gaius rejected the 4th Gospel from other traditions, but we don't know the connection that he said it was by Cerinthus is actually made by Dionysius Barsalibi, who's a medieval Syrian and writing in Syriac. And so he's quite late. So most people are like, well, how could he possibly truly transmit a accurate tradition of Gaius, who's in the late 2nd century, and who's Gaius anyway, and how would he know that? And these are all very important questions. And we need a good study on why someone, a church official in the late 2nd century in Rome, in the heart, the beating heart of empire, why he thought that Cerinthus wrote the Gospel of John. And we need to really let his voice be heard. So I encourage you and anyone else, go look that up. It deserves more research.
Thank you, David. Dr. Little. Sorry, I'm used to Clubhouse seeing people named David
Noti.
No worries.
Okay, yeah. Well, one day we'll be on first name basis, God willing. So, so I think we promised not to keep you any longer, and I want to kind of fulfill my contract with you, or whatever it was. So thank you so much for stopping by. If there was anything that you could recommend for us, I mean, outside of your work, of course, found Christianities. I know you're writing.
I have
or
a particular question to that, if I can ask real quickly. It will take like less than a few
Sure.
seconds. All right. So I was just gonna ask because I'm like getting myself familiar with all this Marcionic priority and looking at the datings, and it basically what I wanted to ask is, what modern work would you recommend, if there is any, that critiques like Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, be it from like a historical or textual critical standpoint?
Well, the work to start with is always Walter Bauer's Orthodoxy and Heresy. It was written in 1934, and I've got on YouTube as well as the Patreon my own book review of Bauer, and so I would start there. And I encourage everyone to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I've just got that started in the last month or so. But and then after Bauer, there obviously if you want to read a little bit of Ehrman, Lost Christianities, and then obviously my Found Christianities is a different take. There's not a lot of broad-based kind of history works that refute the Eusebian model, but I do know that Paula Fredrickson, Boston College, is working on an update of Henry Chadwick's old history. Chadwick is kind of a stuffy Englishman who basically kept to the Orthodox line, and we're now revising that. I'm writing a new book on early Christianity in Alexandria, and there are also other micro studies I don't know them off the top of my head, but there's now very recent literature on regional communities like early Christianity in Ephesus, early Christianity in Rome, early Christianity in Damascus, early Christianity in Jerusalem. So yeah, just pop that into I don't know, Google Scholar or something, and see what you can get. Obviously, those who join the Patreon at a certain level, you can ask me questions anytime, and I can give you very specific recommendations.
That is
Thank
awesome.
you very much. That actually answers the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Litwa. If there's anything else, and again, sorry for the sporadic nature. We had so much to talk about, like with regards to Alexandria and your book on Carpocrates. He's one of my favorite figures to talk about as well because of a lot of different issues and the whole secret Gospel of Mark thing. So hopefully we can set something up in the future to continue the dialogue and kind of prod your brain for our benefit, for lack of a better term. But so thank you so much for attending. And if there's anything else you want to promote or you want to tell the audience and our listeners, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. As I said, yeah, I'm trying to be more of a public intellectual, not too holed up in my study, trying to get lots of good information out there. So yeah, obviously, joining or subscribing to my YouTube channel, which is just my name, M. David Litwa, is free. So check that out. And for those who join at the, I've called it "You Are a God" level of the Patreon, that's basically you can ask me a question anytime. And I've got newer and more detailed material that I have on the Patreon. I've got so you can use YouTube as kind of like an initial kind of starter, and if you get really interested, you can hop on the Patreon. But that's basically it for me. Really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope you guys do well and take care.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much again, and
Thank you, Dr.
and
Litwa.
thank you for being that publicly accessible scholar, so that we can all strive to learn as much about these very, very important topics that have very grandiose implications for all of us.
God willingly.
So thank you again.
Unlike our
And
witness.
yeah, all right.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. We'll see you next time. Thank you everybody for attending. Khalid, do you think we should keep the room open and
no, we'll
bring
make
some
a
people?
post discussion.
Okay, we'll make a post discussion. Okay. We bid you farewell, Dr. Litwa, and we'll talk to you soon.